What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Golladay versus Robinson versus more. Fourth episode in our breakdown series, taking a look at the most difficult decision points in drafts and trying to determine how we would rank these players. So far, we've done Miles Sanders over Kenyon Drake. We've ordered the mid-range wide receivers that we like, McLaurin, then Metcalf, then Chark. And then we've ordered the mid-range running backs, James Conner, then David Johnson, then Melvin Gordon. So you guys asked for another trio. We got it again. I think this is a really good one as well because I did have them ranked 3 back-to-back-to-back. And I like all of them. So another one that's going to definitely be an important decision point, I guess in that like late second to early third round range. So I'm excited to do this one. Before we start, of course, gotta do the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat was from weeks 8 through 16 last season. The top 5 wide receivers in points per game were Michael Thomas, Mike Evans, Julio Jones, DeAndre Hopkins, Devonta Parker, and then I said who was 5th. Obviously, I meant who was 6th. And the answer was Calvin Ridley. I thought that was a little bit interesting. And Steve, last name, was the first to get that one right. Today's stat. The fantasy playoffs are weeks 14, 15, and 16 in most leagues. Which defense last season scored the most total points in those 3 weeks? All right, let's begin this breakdown. And the first player we're going to go over is Kenny Golladay. Now, this will be Galladay's 4th season in the league, but he's also turning 27. So he was an extremely old rookie. He's gone over 1,000 yards in each of the last 2 seasons, finishing as a wide receiver 26 and then 9 in points per game. And the wide receiver 9 finish last season was extremely impressive when you consider that Stafford was out, for half of the season. Stafford had a 6.5% touchdown rate and 8.6 yards per attempt in his 8 starts. But when you combine David Blau and Jeff Driscoll, they had a 2.8% touchdown rate and 6 yards per attempt, which, of course, is going to hurt Golladay. He averaged 15.2 fantasy points per game with Stafford healthy, but then 11.8 without him. Had he maintained that 15.2 points per game, so say Stafford stays healthy for the whole season, continues that production, would have finished as the wide receiver 4 in points per game. This season, we kind of have to work under the assumption that Stafford's going to stay healthy. And that's not just like a crazy thing to think because Stafford had played 8 consecutive seasons starting all 16 weeks leading up to last year. Last season, people were concerned about Marvin Jones on 2 fronts. So they thought Marvin Jones might limit the downfield upside of Golladay. That proved not to be the case. Golladay tied Stephon Diggs with the most catchable deep targets last season. People also saying that maybe Marvin Jones would limit Galladay's touchdown upside. That was also not the case. Golladay finished with the 3rd most end zone targets in the NFL last season. And again, this is with only half a season with Stafford. He probably leads the league in both of those if Stafford is healthy all year. And if you're wondering why I mention these specific stats, it's because they're the highest value targets. So even if he's expected to see fewer overall targets than other players going around him, we know that a lot of his targets are coming deep downfield and they're coming in the end zone. And that's what we want for fantasy. So Golladay may have finished 23rd and 29th in targets per game over the last 2 years, but his targets are worth so much more. Each target is worth more than a lot of other players that it's going to make up for having fewer overall targets. So I just wanted to bring that up because, he only has roughly 7.5 targets per game over these last 2 years. So it's like some people might look at that and be a little bit concerned. His targets are very different than like Julian Edelman's targets, right? Edelman needs more targets to produce like Golladay does. Golladay doesn't need all those. So what do I expect this season? Well, Stafford should be back, and the situation as a whole should be fairly similar. There's not a lot changing in Detroit. You've still got Golladay, Jones, and Amendola. You've still got Hawkinson at tight end. The running back core improved with Swift, but I don't think that's going to be a major impact to Golladay. Maybe Swift takes more targets than the other running backs did, but that'll be offset by the offense overall just improving. So there might just be more yards overall because they're staying on the field longer. There might be more touchdowns to be scored. So I think overall Swift is actually a positive for Golladay. It's always nice to have a better offense. So if we look at that, I do expect similar production to what we saw over the first half last season. And over that half, he was on pace for 70 receptions, a little under 1,300 yards, and 14 touchdowns. Now, the 14 touchdowns, you should never just expect a player to score that. I would say on average, he should score maybe like in that 10 to 12 range. But that means that in his early third round ADP, as the wide receiver 8 off the board, that is extremely fair. It's tough to call that a value because of how much we put an emphasis on running backs, but I think it's a good pick. So he's not someone where it's like, oh my goodness, he's going in the early third. That's incredible. No, that's where he should be going, and I think if you want to take him there, I think that's a good pick. Up next, we've got Allen Robinson. This will be Robinson's 7th season in the league, but he's actually the same age as Golladay. And a side note on that, happy birthday, Allen Robinson. It's his birthday as of the day I'm recording this, so Monday. So you guys are watching this the day after his birthday. But happy birthday, Allen. I know you're not watching this, but whatever. Anyways, so we all remember Allen Robinson's breakout, right? 2015, 1,400 yards and 14 touchdowns. Finished as the wide receiver 6 in points per game. But a note on that, it really just depends on the year, right? So 2015 was a crazy good year for wide receivers. If he has that same season last year, he's the wide receiver 2 in points per game by a wide margin. So you got to take that into a little bit of context. He had 1,400 yards and 14 touchdowns. That's a pretty good season. Next 3 seasons, not as good. He had 2 down years. He had the missed season with the torn ACL. So kind of mediocre production. Then last year, he goes off. 98 receptions, about 1,150 yards, and 7 touchdowns. Tied Amari Cooper for 12th in points per game. That stat line is, of course, great, but I don't think it does his season justice. As per Matt Harmon in reception perception, he had a 98th percentile success rate versus man, 97th percentile success rate versus press. Both of those rank inside the top 10 in reception perception history. He was dominant last season, and it would have been a special season had Trubisky not been terrible. You know, Trubisky had the worst season of his career in terms of yards per attempt, air yards per attempt, yards per completion, sacks taken, adjusted net yards per attempt. And it's not like his first 2 seasons were all that good, right? It wasn't just like Trubisky was amazing, and then, he was less good last season. He was pretty mediocre, and then he was really bad last year. And I bring this up because I want you to realize that it couldn't really get worse, right? I mean, I'd be genuinely shocked if the combination of Trubisky and Foles plays that poorly this season. So I am expecting improved quarterback play. And if they can improve from 29th in points per game and 26th in yards per game, then that's going to benefit Robinson. And given that they ranked 10th and 20th in those stats in 2018, I see no reason to believe that they can't achieve those numbers again this season. As for what I expect this season, the touchdown numbers should be lower than Galladay's, but he's going to have more receptions to kind of make up for that. The industry seems to be projecting pretty much what he did last year. Around 95 receptions in that 1,100 to 1,150 yard range, 6 to 8 touchdowns. I think that's fair. On the high end, he could definitely crush 100 receptions. So this is a player who could get 110, 115 receptions if everything works out. I think the most likely outcome is that he does kind of end up in that mid-90s range. And even though I expect the Bears to improve overall, the Golladay touchdown numbers are so much higher. Golladay could score 18 touchdowns. Probably not going to happen, but he has that ceiling. Robinson doesn't really have that sort of ceiling, so I think projecting him for that 6 to 8 touchdown range seems fair when we're projecting Golladay for more and 10 to 12. So that's a first lean if we're looking at scoring format that's going to impact things. When we're in PPR leagues, we are being more favorable towards these players who can get 110, 115 receptions over the guys who have a lot of touchdowns but less receptions. as we move more towards standard scoring leagues, well, we want guys like Golladay who are going to score a ton of touchdowns, and we can sacrifice the receptions because we don't care. The receptions don't matter at that point. So scoring format is definitely going to come into play here. But we've got more player to talk about, and that's DJ Moore. Now, Moore is entering his third season, but it's at age 23. He's the same age that Golladay was in his senior year of college. Just think about that for a second. Moore had a 99th percentile college target share. He had a 97th percentile college dominator rating, 98th percentile breakout age. He was dominant in college, even though he was incredibly young. What does he do as a pro? First season, at age 21, 55 for 788 and 2 touchdowns. Then last season, 87 for 1,175 yards and 4 touchdowns. And that's with mostly Kyle Allen and Will Grier at quarterback. And that sort of stat line is more impressive when you consider he didn't play in week 17. And he only played 6 snaps in week 16. So he only had 14 healthy weeks. In his 16-week pace in those games, 152 targets, 98 receptions, 1,342 yards, 4.6 touchdowns, again, with Kyle Allen and Will Grier. Now, I do want to make sure that you don't think Moore is the greatest wide receiver of all time. Obviously, he was incredible last season. His upside is amazing, and he definitely hasn't peaked yet. But even with that stat line, he was still only the wide receiver 13 in points per game through week 15. And while he performed great, it was because his best routes were on slants, and Diggs ran those 45% of the time. And those aren't difficult throws to make. So given that he had very mediocre quarterback play, it's possible that that helped him a little bit gain this massive target share. Because if we look at Samuel was really good last season. He crushed Moore in success rate versus man, versus press. He posted a better or equal success rate as Moore in a number of different routes. It's just that Samuel ran deep a ton, and his quarterbacks couldn't throw deep. So there's a chance that a lot of the production Moore had was due to the fact that Samuel may have been open on these deep routes, but they just couldn't get him the ball. And when you're running easy routes for bad quarterbacks to throw to, you're going to have a higher target share. So there is a chance that they bring in Robbie Anderson. They say, hey, Robbie Anderson, you're running more of these deep routes. We're going to have Samuel join Moore on more of these underneath and intermediate routes. And if that happens, it's possible. I'm not saying it's going to happen. It's possible that Moore just doesn't improve on his 2019 numbers because Samuel is a good wide receiver and he will take some of that share. I still want to remind you what I talked about right before this, that at age 22, his 16-week pace was 98 receptions, 1,342 yards, and 4.6 touchdowns. And while you could argue that, well, Robinson had a great age 22 season as well, that came with Bortles at quarterback throwing 35. This was a career season for Bortles. 35 touchdowns and 7.3 yards per attempt. Moore did not have that last season. So, those are 3 breakdowns. How do I rank them? I've actually adjusted the rankings after doing this breakdown because I had Robinson first. And I do think that's a mistake. I still love him and have him above ECR, above ADP. But Golladay beats him out in my eyes. The Lions are going to have the better offense. And given where his targets are, Golladay has a much higher ceiling than Robinson. Again, something I want to point out, that difference is much closer in full PPR. I think I would still go with Golladay in a full PPR league, which means I'd go with him in every format because it's the closest in full PPR. But honestly, it's a coin flip. In a full PPR league, Robinson versus Golladay is a coin flip, and you should take the one you feel best about. I think for me, it is still going to be Golladay. And again, that means he beats him in all formats. As for Moore, the concern that Samuel performs a little bit better with improved quarterback play and not running as many deep routes is enough for me to drop him behind Golladay. Between Moore and Robinson, I think it is super close. It's another one where it's like, I don't care which one you take. Take the one you genuinely feel better about. If it is me, I'm taking Moore. And the biggest reason is actually the touchdowns, which might be confusing, but hear me out on that one. Moore did not post high-end wide receiver 1 numbers last season only because he only had the 4 touchdowns. And while he had the receptions, he had the yardage, the touchdowns were lacking, and it's tough to post high-end numbers without the touchdowns. However, Carolina ranked last by a wide margin in passing touchdown percentage last year, meaning that of the touchdowns they scored, no other team threw for a lower percentage than they did. Moore also had 5.5 expected touchdowns, so on average, he should have scored more. And given that I also expect the Panthers to score more total touchdowns this season, there's a lot of things going in his favor. You know, you might think that the ceiling for touchdowns isn't that high, but if he was unlucky last season and they didn't score as many touchdowns overall than we expect, and they threw for a very low percentage, that's 3 different things that are all contributing to a potentially greater ceiling than you might think. And when you combine that with his production to date and his talent, I do think that my ranking, and it's not think, my ranking is Golladay, Moore, then Robinson. So, that is the end of this breakdown. Remember that you can check out my exact rankings on all players at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. But that's the end of this one. Hope you all did enjoy. If you did, how about hitting that like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new? Thanks for watching.